So we're so happy to be partnering with the parents group DEI 200, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Council for District 200 for our Talking About Race series. So talking about race and racism often can make people uncomfortable. Have you ever thought about how that discomfort affects the other person? So in our first session, we established that we should see color. So now we need to discuss how that color can affect our everyday lives. So tonight we'll be discussing just being open to that discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Anjali Bharadwa of DEI 200. Thanks so much, Anjali.
Hi, guys. I'm going to share my screen here. So we have a little PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go through to begin with. So just double checking. Are we able to see it, Courtney?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, excellent. So we'll get started. Okay, so again, my name is Anjali Bharadwa, and I am a resident of Wheaton. I am first generation Indian. My parents were born in India, but I have 3 kids in the district. My youngest is a first grader at Madison. I have a 7th grader at Edison and a 9th grader at South. I am not actually educated at all as far as DEI is concerned. During the day, I'm actually a project manager for a Microsoft consultant, but I do try to do as much as I can to participate in these kind of conversations and activism at night. So I did create the DEI 200 group, and I'm part of District 200's Equity Task Force. So what is DEI 200? You guys might have heard that term be thrown around a little bit. So I wanted to just tell you guys a bit about it a little bit more. And so DEI 200 is, our mission is to amplify all voices with dialogue and action for District 200's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and strive for everyone in our community to have a sense of belonging. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish here at DEI 200. So just a real quick overview. For those of you guys have came to our first session, some of this might be a repeat, so I'll go through them kind of quickly. But essentially the student engagement part of DEI 200 is looking at the curriculum, perhaps some of the curriculum like Columbus Day, or perhaps making sure that we have more diverse curriculum, so where people can identify people that look like themselves, try to get our students engaged in new ways to be taught this type of curriculum is what DEI 200 is being focused on. I should also mention that it is a parents group. So we're trying to do events that are, educational discussions like today, have multicultural days, book clubs, and then also do some outreach. So reaching out to communities who haven't participated much in the past, addressing other things like why have people not participated in the past, and try to gather and get feedback from other people. So DEI 200 is a new group. We just started it over the summer, but we're definitely making some progress already. And, again, just a brief introduction, but definitely reach out to us if you have additional questions and interested in learning more. I am also joined by a group of panelists today, so I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. Our first one is Tim Callahan. So Tim, if you want to.
Anjali, I don't think the slides are moving.
Uh-oh. Did I share my wrong screen? Let's do it again. Sorry about that.
Technical difficulties. It happens with Zoom. We're well used to it by now. There we go.
I shared the wrong screen. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Tim.
Oh, thank you, Anjali. My name is Tim Callahan. I'm the principal at Madison Elementary School here in Wheaton. Proud principal of Anjali's youngest, as she said. I was born and raised in Wheaton and Warrenville, back and forth most of my whole life. Previously, before Madison, I was the principal at Johnson Elementary School and started my teaching career on the north side of the district at Pleasant Hill. My kids have attended a lot of District 200 schools: Wiesbrook, Bauer, Madison, Hubble, and Wheaton, Warrenville South. And echoing what Anjali said also, I am definitely not an expert in this field by any means, but am excited to. I have found myself desperately seeking growth and just trying to be a better human. So this has been a good, meaningful study for me too.
Thank you, Tim. And next, oh, now we're going the wrong way. There we go. Next we have Lee.
Hi, I have lived in Wheaton since '79. I moved here from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's where I was born and raised. Spent some formative years in Dade County Public Schools at the height of desegregation in the early 70s. Moved back to Pittsburgh and then here. So I think of myself primarily as a teacher and a parent. I did recently retire, so this is a big shift for me. It's given me a great opportunity to spend a lot of time reading and thinking and getting involved in other ways that I haven't been able to when I was teaching. I think probably my interest specifically in racial justice was kind of, the catalyst was Trayvon Martin's murder in 2012. That's when I really started thinking, pretty deeply about how my whiteness plays out and how people's blackness plays out. So that's kind of my racial epiphany, which I know is only 8 years ago, and that's kind of sad. But as a white person, I know I'm not alone in having this be a relatively new journey. And so I'm grateful to be invited here. Again, like everyone else, I'm just trying to do any part I can to make things more equitable, and mostly here to learn, but to share and jump into the discussion, even though it's a little bit nervousy, isn't it? It's hard to put yourself out there and have conversations. So I appreciate the opportunity and hope people who are listening will participate with questions and their ideas.
Excellent. Caroline.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Caroline Kisiel. I live in downtown Wheaton. I've been living here for 12 years. I grew up in Winfield, where I was not born in Illinois. I was born in Buffalo, New York, but we moved here in, I actually been an Illinois resident since I was about 2, but we were in Winfield from 76. And so I went to Winfield Elementary School, Winfield Middle School. I went to West Chicago very briefly, and then Wheaton Academy, where I transferred from West Chicago, and was called Wheaton Christian High School at the time. So a lot of roots here in the western suburbs, but moved away for quite a while. Lived for many years in Chicago, various parts of the city. I lived in London, England. As I said, I'm an associate professor at DePaul, and my Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholar work is because I'm also a literary historian, and I write about early Illinois and how there was a presence of slavery in early Illinois, and I'm writing a book about that. But what I wanted to share, and it just in line with what Lee was just sharing, is in 1987, when I was in college, I was in college in Michigan. I was at a small Christian college in Michigan, and there was an urban studies program that brought me to Chicago. And so at that time was when I was immersed in a lot of learning about issues of race, issues of diversity, issues of class, how everything all intermingled together. And it was really 33 years ago now, and I can still look back on that very humbly as a time of immense learning for me, difficult learning certain things about the city of Chicago that I had lived less than an hour from for so many years growing up, and did not know of all of the dynamics that were happening. I do also want to say, though, that I don't consider myself an expert. I just feel like I'm constantly also learning. And in my teaching, I work with high percentage of African-American students. We have many conversations about DEI work, what's happening in the world, what's transpiring in our country, and in our city, and in particular in the city and the suburbs. So excited to be part of this panel. Thank you for the invitation, and look forward to contributing. And I'm also nervously. So these are nerve-wracking kinds of conversations, but I'm excited to be here bravely with all of you.
Thank you, Caroline. Anne?
Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Ha. I am a first-generation Vietnamese American. Both my parents were born in Vietnam and then immigrated here about 25 years ago. I am a Washington Elementary alum, a Monroe Middle School alum. I also graduated from Wheaton North High School, and I am now a sophomore in college. For work, I am a teacher at Goldfish Swim School in Glen Ellen, so I'm still very local. My credentials, I suppose, besides being a woman of color, would be that I led 2 Black Lives Matter marches in Wheaton. I also spoke at a climate change protest in Naperville, and I am also a part of the D200 Equity Task Force. I am very excited to be here and honored for the opportunity to have some dialogue with everyone.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks everybody for introducing. I actually wanted to bring up this study that Tim Callahan brought to my attention, and I thought it was actually so relevant for today. And it appeared that it happened in about 2010, I think 2012 is when they conducted the study. And they compared how people felt about if their child had married somebody from a different political party and how it compared from somebody in 1960 versus how it looks to what it looked like in 2010. And the point of this kind of study is you can see how things have changed and how, I mean, this is done in 2010 and how things have become so super polarized that when you come to a discussion with somebody who has different views than you can kind of completely shut down. And you don't even want to engage, you're not willing to learn. And that's kind of our topic for today, which is being open for a discussion, right? Being willing to learn and kind of see a different perspective. And I mean, I'll be honest, I'm guilty of this too. I actually, like, I probably would have similar thoughts if my child came home with somebody from a different political party, especially as we all have our news program sitting somewhere in the background seeing what's happening today. But you know, the conversation might be difficult. We've heard that from our panelists. We understand that from you too. This work isn't easy, and feeling uncomfortable is okay. Like, we understand that talking about race and racism typically is. But what are our goals for today? So we can't end racism, right? Like, it's just not going to happen during an hour-long conversation that we have here on Zoom. But we can have these conversations that get us started towards addressing it, right? So it can feel daunting to try to address racism in the entire world, but you know, at least what we can do is affect our own communities and the spaces that we interact in, and that we can leave this discussion feeling more informed than when we started. So those are our goals for today. Again, those are a repeat from last time. As a reminder, we are going through the series. Last time we talked about the idea of should we be colorblind? I'm going to do a brief overview of kind of some of the conclusions to that. Today we're talking about being open to a discussion. Then we're going to go more into systemic racism and, you know, becoming an anti-racist. But I do think that this work of having some self-reflection is very important, and being open to a discussion before we really can get into those different topics. So the color blindness, here's just a kind of a quick recap on what we talked about there. But generally speaking, the answer to the question is yes, you should see color. And the reasons why are numerous, but essentially is basically by not seeing color, you invalidate any kind of racist experience that somebody can come and talk to you about, or, you know, and it's disingenuous, along with, you know, a number of other options. So we basically came to the conclusion that yes, you should see color, and now we need to be open to a discussion of when that happens, right? We're going to start off with the idea of white privilege, right? So what is white privilege? It's a term that some people find upsetting. They can get offensive, and it refers to the concept, they find the term offensive, but it refers to the concept that people have basic rights and benefits simply because they are white. It doesn't mean that they haven't suffered hardship or that they don't have a tough life, just that the color hasn't made their life any harder. So there are some typical responses that you hear to this term of white privilege, is that I didn't grow up wealthy, just like James Corden kind of explained, that they had to work hard for their success, that race has not affected my life. And I do not think about race, right, when we talk about it. And I've personally seen a lot of pushback to this phrase. And I think the best analogy that helps describe it is that a white person's journey to success can be described as swimming with the current, where a Black person's journey can be swimming against the current. Additionally, white people often believe that race hasn't affected my life because they don't have to think about it. Not having it doesn't not having to think about it is a privilege in and of itself. And white people will claim that a person of color will always make something about race when it isn't, just because they didn't realize it. So I also want to point out that there is a spectrum to privilege. The term white privilege is used often just because, well, I don't know why it's used often, but it is. And it's not only white people that can be racist. So Asian American, American Indian, Asian, Pacific Islander, Black, Hispanic, and people of multiple ethnicities typically experience racism very differently. And so colorism within a race can also affect an individual's experience. So sorry, my notes are showing up in a funny place, but if you guys see me looking to the side, that's why. But this is a picture of me and my family and my sister's family. So kind of a little side note, I am a little darker skinned than my sister. Even though we grew up in the very same house, in the same schools, in the same neighborhoods, we experienced racism very differently based on the color of our skin. Now that she has a white husband and white passing children, it's actually grown even further as I have an Indian husband and Indian looking children. So it's something that I think is important to acknowledge as well. As we're talking about this conversation, there is a man, his name is Emmanuel Acho, and he's a sports analyst, and he used to be on ESPN. I heard he doesn't do it anymore, but he's created a series of YouTube videos that discusses these various different topics, such as the one that we're talking about here, as well as white allergies, interracial relationships, religion, and more. But we don't have time to show you all of the different videos about it, but I do think that it is something that he brings up some very good points about how, with depending on your skin color and race, it can be an unfair race to try to achieve success, and how things like Black people are perceived as a threat, whiteness can be weaponized, and that you can live unconsciously, if you're white. A couple other things that I wanted to talk about in terms of opportunities. Right, in education specifically, and again, DEI 200 tries to focus on our schooling in our school district. In education, we find that predominantly Black schools have been often less equipped than what we find here in Wheaton. So there are also privileges found within the education system. Advanced courses might not be offered, or a student must make sacrifices to be able to get them. And ambition can sometimes even be discouraged due to the reality of systemic racism. So I've heard plenty of personal stories too, that when the best students do make it to college, even against all their odds, they basically have to adjust their lives and their culture to basically, adapt to what is around them. So there are a lot of different areas that we're kind of thinking about here. When you're talking about privilege, you could also be talking about applying for a job. 25% of Black candidates received callbacks from their Wheaton resumes, while only 10% got callbacks if they left their ethnic details intact. So amongst Asians, 21% got called back if they used a Wheaton resume, whereas only 11.5% heard back if they sent it in with the racial references. We're going to get more into this topic in particular in further sessions about systemic racism, but there's also in terms of criminal justice system. So for the exact same crime, a white person is, a Black person will be in jail for 20 times, screwing up today, sorry guys. A Black person will be in jail for 20 times longer for the same crime, and there are 6 times more Black people in prison than white. So there are a lot of areas in which privilege can show itself between professionally, educationally, through the criminal justice system reform. So that's kind of the overall talk about like white privilege or privilege in general. Before we get into this next term called white fragility. So I actually have a poll, Courtney, that we were planning on launching. If you can bring that up for me. A couple of quick questions to kind of see if you guys have heard about these terms before. So I'll give you guys about 30 seconds to answer. Courtney, are you informed when people are done answering?
Yes, and this is anonymous, so be honest, please.
Excellent. So we're asking you on the little post here, but for White Fragility, it is a book by Robin DiAngelo. And so we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail and show you a video. They're a little bit over time where I'm expecting, so I might try to cut it a little bit, but we'll see. How are we doing with results, Courtney?
We are at 86%. So we have 5 people that did not answer, which I think is pretty good. So I think
ahead,
that is a
Jerem.
good, yeah, let's see here. Okay. Can you guys see all, the poll results?
Yep.
All right.
So we actually have a good amount of people that have read the book. So you guys will be some experts for us. And then, you know, some people who haven't read it at all or are familiar with the term. And then a good percentage of our people for our audience today do acknowledge that it exists, and that we still have people who don't like the term. And I've heard that before too. They just, you know, for whatever reason, the term rubs them the wrong way, but that in itself is a privilege, right? So continuing forward with our information here about white fragility. So especially for those of you who are not familiar with it, white fragility is the discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. So generally speaking, I do have a video set up here too. So I know we're a little bit over where I wanted to, because I do want to get into the Q&A portion, but I do think that this part is important too. So I'm going to go ahead and play as much as I can of this video here.
And every week, I unpack my strong opinions with the help of an expert who might not have all the answers, but they certainly know more than I do. That's why this is Strong Opinions Loosely Held. And on this week's show, what does it mean to be white? And why are white people so bad at talking about race? After spending 20 years running diversity trainings for big companies, Dr. Robin DiAngelo has heard every excuse in the book from white people on why they weren't racist. They had a black friend at work. They were colorblind. They did Teach for America.
Because, I mean, I'm vegetarian, so how could I be racist?
White people provided her with all of their evidence and credentials that proved they couldn't be racist.
Put on your seatbelt, listeners. Yeah. White people are all racist.
So after 2 decades of talking to white people about race, Dr. DiAngelo realized that not only were white people terrible at talking about racism, but they were oblivious to it, even millennials.
I've been doing a lot of work with tech companies, and most of the employees are under 30, and they are oblivious. They see themselves as open, and yet they can't engage with any nuance or depth. And so they're flabbergasted when there are very few coworkers of color share with them how much pain they're in.
Why are white people oblivious to racism? Well, for one, we can't even answer what it means to be white or have a race.
If I can't answer that question, what does it mean to be white, I'm not going to be able to hold what it means not to be white. I'm not going to have any ability to validate an alternative experience. And that is what it's like for people of color every day. When they try to talk to us about their realities, we, in a range of ways, refuse that reality. Most of us will claim that race has no meaning to us. Or if it has meaning to us, we've been in no way touched by racist conditioning or racist messages. Most of us feel exempt from the literal water we're swimming in.
And the reason we feel exempt from the entire world around us is because we've convinced ourselves that we're different from other white people. Look, we know some white people are racist, but we're not like them.
This idea that we're all special and unique, and that if I just knew this about you, I'd know why you were different. After all, you've been in Teach for America, haven't you?
All right, so let me get this straight. We don't want to acknowledge our own race despite living in a society where it has profound meaning, which makes it really hard to talk about racism. And yet the most offensive thing to call a white person is a racist. What's up with that?
Racists are mean individuals who consciously don't like people based on race and intentionally seek to harm them. If that is your definition of a racist, and I say to you, boy, what you just said was racist, you're going to hear that I just said you were an intentionally mean person.
Right.
And you're going to experience that as a question to your very moral integrity.
Right, because then it means you're a bad person and you're immoral.
Right. Everyone has racial bias. But this is part of what makes it so challenging. We know it on some level, but we can't admit to it because we believe it would mean we were immoral.
Dr. DiAngelo pointed out that white people live the most segregated lives of any other racial group. Let that sink in for a second. We, white people, are the most segregated group of any race. And when we describe our segregated environments, we call them good.
when you tell me this is a good neighborhood, the assumption is it's white. When you tell me it's a good school, that's the assumption. When you tell me it's coming up, it's getting whiter. You tell me it's going down, getting less white. You tell me it's sketchy, not white. White people measure the value of our schools and our neighborhoods by the absence of people of color.
All of this adds up to the dynamic that Dr. D'Angelo calls white fragility. But basically, it's the idea that white people are totally unable to sustain even the most minimal level of racial discomfort.
We make it so miserable for people of color to talk to us about our inevitable and often unaware racist patterns that most of the time, trust me, they don't. It's not worth it. They risk more punishment. They risk our hurt feelings, our defensiveness. If we're white women, they risk us bursting into tears. And then they become the aggressor and we become the victim. And so it's a really effective form of everyday white racial control.
Our culture is really, really good at reproducing racial inequality. It's what we've always done. And so in order for the system to maintain itself, all we have to do as white people is just be nice.
Just be really nice. Go smile at your coworkers of color. Go to lunch on occasion. Don't do anything else. And you will play your part. Niceness is not anti-racism. It takes strategic, intentional action.
So how do white people help end racism? Well, first of all, we have to admit that we are racist. That's the biggest and the best thing that we can do, because after that, it's all downhill.
Because you can stop defending, deflecting, denying, being defensiveness, being guilty. I often ask people of color when I'm in front of a group, what would it be like if you could just tell us when we stepped in it and had us receive that feedback with grace, reflect, and seek to change the behavior? What would that be like? And I'll never forget this man of color raising his hand and saying, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to take that in, revolutionary, that we would receive the feedback with grace on our inevitable and often unaware racist patterns, reflect on them, and seek to change them. That's how difficult we are. That's a revolution. But that's how easy it is. We just can't get there from the current paradigm that says, I've been untouched by the forces of racism, and if you suggest I've been touched by them, you just said I was bad. We can't.
All right, I'm going to stop it there just to save us a little bit of time here. But so I hope you guys see that the idea of the videos, and one of the reasons why I'm bringing the videos in, is that to give us a baseline of what these terms are and what we kind of mean to be open to a discussion, right? What does privilege mean, and what does white fragility mean? And so now that we all are on the same baseline of the understanding, now we're going to move it over to our question and answer section, where I'm going to ask questions to our group of panelists here for their feedback. One thing I would also like to invite you guys all to do is to participate in the conversation. So if you, everybody's been on Zoom now, but in case you haven't, on the bottom of your controls for Zoom, there is a Q&A feature. So you can go in and type in your question or any comments that you have about our conversation into the Q&A section. Only the panelists will see it, but Courtney will be monitoring those questions and comments, and then Courtney will just speak up whenever you have something that an audience member has asked. So feel free to go ahead. You guys can get started if you have any questions now. I'm going to go ahead and start and throw my first question out to Lee. So Lee, we just watched the video by Robin DeAngelo that describes the White Fragility book. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen as well. So she said, white people, put on your seatbelts. We are all racist. How do you feel about this statement?
Initially, I think it's hard to hear, right? Because of the way, and she does such a good job of framing that we think these are bad people who intentionally hurt others, and you know, kind of the picture of the segregationist. And we don't like to think of ourselves as being racist. So the first thing we have to do is just allow ourselves to hear that and sit with that. And I think that's one of the most important things. I do think because whiteness is centered in our world, and particularly in America, obviously, and in places like Wheaton, whiteness is centered. And so, you know, having to overcome all of this really indoctrination that we've had, that it's hard to hear, but it's true. We have to work at that, and we have to accept the fact that we have to actively work against all the messages we've been sent and what we've internalized, even though we don't want to be that way. We have to really work to overcome that. So I agree.
All right, thank you for that. According to Robin DiAngelo, when white people hear the term racist, they tend to think of the mean bigot who intentionally hurts other people. What do you think of that definition of a racist, Caroline?
Well, as I mentioned in my introduction, I've been thinking about these things for many years and working on different levels with them. But I have to say that I don't think of it just as that, but that is the first automatic thing that happens. And that's what I would like to name, that as a white person, I automatically think that of that, segregationist, the Ku Klux Klan member, that's the person who's racist, or the person that on social media is really blatant out there, or someone that you might see in the news. Oh, that person's is racist. And what I think is important about naming that's my automatic response is that then what that means is that's an opportunity for a self-check and go, oh, this, and to not internalize it and feel shame, like, oh my gosh, I still don't see that in myself, because I'm agreeing with what Lee was saying as well. It's very uncomfortable. But I also want to say that it's a lifelong deconditioning, untangling all of these ideas and messages that we've internalized from our society. I mean, our society has really taught us who we are based on the skins that we have been born into.
Excellent. And also, I just want to say that this is definitely intended to be an organic conversation. So for the rest of the panelists and anybody else, please feel free to jump in if you guys have any comments or want to add to, an answer. So Lee and Tim, if you guys want anything to add, otherwise I'll move on to my next question here. All right. So in that video that we watched, Robin DiAngelo said that a man that Robin DiAngelo was referring to, saying that white people accepting feedback about their racist actions with grace would be revolutionary. What does it say about our society, how our society currently responds to minorities who talks about their experiences with racism? And I wanted to throw this question out for you.
Yeah, I mean, it would be kind of revolutionary, which I guess is kind of sad. But in my experience, discussing race with white people in particular has just been kind of an uphill battle, because half of the time I'm spending so much of my mental energy trying to reword things in a way that is palatable. How do I make my experience as an Asian American, how do I make my trauma or pain, or how do I explain what it's like to feel like a foreigner in the place I was born to someone who doesn't ever have to think about that, or doesn't want to acknowledge that, or is very content in not acknowledging that. I think that if all of my conversations had gone in a way that was like, oh, that really sucks, but I'm here and I'm listening and I'm open, and talk to me about it, like I want to learn more about it, instead of it being like, oh, but I don't do that, or that same trope of, oh, I can't be privileged because my parents don't have a lot of money, or I didn't go to a private school, but privilege doesn't just look economic. I have many privileges myself, even as a woman and someone who's from a minority. I speak English fluently. That's a privilege that my parents didn't have. I'm a US citizen. That's a tremendous privilege that most of us take for granted. I benefit from colorism. I'm an Asian American woman, but I have a lighter skin tone, so I haven't had people around me tell me that I'm undesirable for being of a darker skin tone. I've been to wonderful schools where I always have access to the internet. That's a privilege in itself. So, acknowledging your privileges is not an incriminating thing. It doesn't make you a bad person. And if everyone could realize that we all have privileges in every branch, then yes, that would be totally revolutionary.
Thanks, Anne. I know I mentioned this a little bit during our first talk too, but it's one of those things that when I bring something up that has happened, and again, it comes up very often with the colorblind conversation, and I'll be like, I think it has something, is it because I'm Indian, because I'm a brown woman? And they'll be like, no, it has nothing to do with that. And I think them accepting the fact that something has happened to me because of my brown skin, I do believe would be revolutionary. So I think that's such a strong statement that that Rob and D'Angelo made. We have a comment here. Courtney, I'm going to read the first one. So would it be appropriate to mention that Wheaton's police force of 67, 2 are Afro-American, 4 are Latinx, and 3 are Asian? So I don't know. I guess it sounds like it's something appropriate to mention for sure. It definitely comes in a lot when we talk about systemic racism and how the criminal justice plays in. We've also been talking about how education, I know CUSD 200 has been talking about it a lot too, that the power of a student seeing themselves in their teacher and having somebody to look up to them, somebody who looks like them, and that feeling of belonging. So I guess any of the panelists, do you guys have any thoughts on the makeup of the Wheaton police force? Don't know here. So we might have to come back to that one. I'm going to plug our next one. We do actually have somebody who is very well spoken on the criminal justice system. So you'll have to come back for part 3, and we'll put Courtney, let's mark that one down here. Do you have a question ready for our group?
Yes. The next question, one feature of white fragility that I found most eye-opening was the notion that my successes have not necessarily been something I earned because of some special skill, but in many ways was the product of my white privilege. So most definitely not available to all. Yeah. And then next question, did you want to go to the next question?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
In Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says we should destigmatize the word racist to make it more neutral. Just not being racist isn't enough. A person has to actively fight against racism for progress. That's a good point.
So one of the things I'll share with you all is I do these talks for work as well. And I shared with my whole company actually a time in where I had been racist. And I had a racist thought. I had my unconscious bias took over and I had to address it. And so afterwards, talking with my boss, and I said that I had a racist thought, and he's like, well, maybe not racist. And I'm like, it's okay. We can say that I had a racist thought. Just because I'm leading these discussions doesn't mean that I am exempt from that. Everybody has these biases, and we destigmatizing it, that term is definitely important. So thank you for bringing that point up. My next question I'm going to give to you, Tim. The White Fragility video states that the biggest thing that white and non-Black people can do to help end racism is to admit that they are racist. How do you feel about this statement?
Ouch. Yeah, it's so difficult to do. Like you all said, that word has such a horrible stigma for good reason. It's a horribly difficult thing to do. None of us like to admit our faults. None of us like to admit that we even have faults, right? I think it goes back to the graphics you shared at the beginning of the presentation. I mean, I feel like we're all so proud in our culture that it's hard to admit and difficult to admit that we're anything less than perfect, or that we didn't pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Yeah, it's really difficult to admit that, like you said, when in your workplace, that you've ever had a thought you're not proud of.
Anybody else want to contribute to that comment?
I'll add a little something. And this is just lingering a bit also on the comment about realizing that there are some, we work hard for our successes, and to realize that maybe part of it wasn't earned, that part of it may have been a product of our white privilege. And I think there's a tie-in, as I think about my work as an historian, that we're taught a lot of things in our democracy as well. So I think that that's one of the things we can name, piggybacking off of what you said, Tim, is that not only is it about whiteness, but what we have been taught as white people in the United States, and I study the early American nations, so it just, pulling yourself up by your bootstrap, perfect example, because who gets to pull themselves up by the bootstraps? And if everybody's taught that, are those bootstraps actually working for everybody of every color? No. So.
I will say one of my little aha moments too, similar to what Anne was saying, just because I'm a woman and a person of color doesn't mean I'm not privileged. I am definitely privileged in so many ways as well. And I used to have this thought process that if anybody worked hard enough and, had some kind of ability, they would be able to achieve anything. And I was listening to a podcast about a girl being the smartest girl in the room. And long story short, she ends up working in a supermarket. Right. And she's smarter than all of the kids that are at the best private schools in the area. But that's where she ended up, because no matter how hard she worked, and no matter, the intention that she had, the ability that she had, she wasn't able to pull out of, that area. And I didn't realize, just by being able to live in a place where, I had the access to AP classes. I had the access to somebody who's saying, yes, if you have the ability, keep going. That's a privilege in and of itself. And I think almost every, obviously there's always room for improvement, but being in District 200 is a privilege.
Okay, we have another question for Anne, but anyone can jump in. After organizing the 2 Black Lives Matters rallies this summer, what are your hopes for the community of Wheaton? Where would you like us to be headed?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. Thank you to the person who wrote it. I am very passionate about education reform. During my experience within various USD 200 schools, my alienation and the fact that I was different became very apparent to me at a very young age. And I think that my hopes for Wheaton moving forward is that we can make schools a place where children of color can enter and not feel the pressure to assimilate, which is a reoccurring theme among students of color. I first realized I was Asian when I was 8. And when I would bring my lunches to school, that my mom would pack me Vietnamese food, so fish and rice and other things that my peers could not pronounce, food that was different from Lunchables, let's say that at least. And I would have other students tell me that my food was smelly or disgusting or looked weird or gross. I had students physically get away from me, move to the side to be farther away from me, move tables to be away from me because I was just too different. And all children want to be accepted, especially at a young age. But then not being able to control something that shouldn't be as polarizing as lunch was very, very difficult for me. So I hope that school lunches can start looking more like food from different countries and not just the same pizzas and hamburgers, and that maybe school advertisements can make foods of all ethnicities look desirable on posters, so that we aren't just seeing the same American food rhetoric. Because really, what is American food if I am America? Another thing I'd love to see is within English and history classes, especially, both sides of the story being taught, especially when it comes to Vietnam War. I'm passionate about because I'm a Vietnamese American. I was watching a documentary that depicted a American soldier talking about his experience in the war. I remember it panned over to a table of the 50 medications he had to take because of all the PTSD from what had happened. And he's talking about My Lai, which was a village that was thought to be harboring communists. And so the American soldiers were given orders to go in and obliterate every living being. They were told that they were going to be met with large gunfire, large resistance, but when the helicopters came down, they were met with farming supplies and women and children. And everyone was murdered, even the goats. And I had to listen to this. And once he finished telling his side of the story, I remember it panned to a Vietnamese woman who was talking about the murder and the rape of her daughter that happened during this raid. And my teacher paused the video and he said, I don't want to violate your young minds, or I want to keep your innocence intact, something around those lines. And he silenced that Vietnamese woman's story. And even till this day, that spoke volumes to me. I think that it's so, so important that we really think about the audience that we're playing to when we're telling the stories of the atrocities that America has committed against other people. And that we also acknowledge that not all students are white students. And not all stories of trauma, will affect different students different ways, and that should be held gently. So that's the hope for Wheaton, is that we do better for our students.
I think that's great, Anne, and probably something that, we have a couple of teachers here on our panel. So you guys have anything to add?
Sure. Wow, Anne, I just thank you for sharing that. It's powerful. It's clear, I think, in our country, in our culture, in our community, that we have a history of encouraging some people to be so proud of their heritage or their ancestral heritage before they came to this country. And then we have a history of telling some people of some cultures that you should drop your culture at the door and you should welcome to the melting pot and assimilate, right? So the more we hear stories that have a world perspective and not just an American perspective is so important. So I really thank you for sharing that, and I agree. We've got to find ways to do better.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we have a couple of other audience questions. Courtney, you want to read one of those?
The next one is, after admitting our racism and making ourselves aware of some history we didn't know before, what are other tangible ways for white folks to make space for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Wheaton?
Throw it up for the panel. Anybody want to take that one? Tim, go ahead.
I'll give it a shot, but someone else can answer it better. Sometimes I think we just need to get out of the way. We need to listen and listen well without taking things personally. We have such a history, I think, or a tendency as Americans, I think, to use certain pronouns when we're proud of certain things. We say we. When the Cubs win, it's a we. When the Bears win, it's a we. Or when we win a battle or an American war, it's a we. But then when we hear about something that is negative, we say they or he or she, or we don't own that. So I think it's important for us to listen, those of us in a majority culture, to listen and to just accept what we hear and to understand that sometimes we're ignorant and we need to learn. And then I think just sometimes once we understand these things, we need to get out of people's way and allow them to have their voice.
Also share my perspective as well. I think that, and obviously coming from as a person of color, we talked last time about how we want you to see our color, but not in a way that says that we are something other or something different. It is a matter of being like, great, but we still have so many other things in common too. Right? We're both moms, we're both in the same community, we both have kids that play soccer, whatever the case may be, right? And look also to see the similarities that you have with your community. And I think that the best way, and Tim, it might have been one of your statements that you had said to me at one point, but one of the best ways is to increase your circle, right? To make spaces by make friends with people who don't look like you, right? And that's probably the best way you're going to make progress in Wheaton. Anyone else? Anne, go ahead.
I'd also like to jump in and just mention that it's very important to listen to people of color tell their stories. It's very important to listen to those around you, but also don't leave it up to your friends of color to be the sole proprietors of your education in regards to race. I want to be your friend. I want to be your neighbor. I want to be the girl who teaches your kids how to swim on Wednesday nights. I don't want to be your professor in why you should care about racism or why my existence is valuable, or why it's unacceptable to ask questions like if I eat dog or not. You know, I don't want to have my entire existence be consumed by race, because a lot of my life has to do with race, but also a lot of my life doesn't. Because I'm at the end of the day, like, we are all human beings. And so be mindful of the emotional labor that you may be putting on those you care about who are people of color. Be mindful of listen, yes, but also don't make it as if someone has to tell you their racial trauma in order for you to believe that something is real.
Courtney, do you want to go with the next question?
Sure. Next question. Am I correct in thinking that the word bias can be used interchangeably with racism in this discussion? That's a good question.
So I'll give you my uneducated answer, and then maybe some of the professors can correct me here. But when I think of bias, I think of, more, I guess bias kind of things of bias where I think of racism was where I think one is superior to the other, right? Where my bias tells me that, I'm biased towards other Indian people or something like that, right? Where racism, I think, has more to do with the feeling of superiority. But I don't think if we use the terms that Robin DiAngelo would say, then no, they're more similar to each other. So I think I could see it both ways. So I guess what do the professors think here? Caroline,
I'll take
looking at you here. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking in particular about the some of the concepts I teach in my critical thinking class, and thinking about bias that could be sort of widely applied to, like, I can be have a particular bias in writing something. I can have a bias towards, I love chocolate. So that can be a bias, right? And if I'm, trying to convince you to also love chocolate, there's a certain come from. But when I think of the word racism, I think it in particular with regard to actions towards a person who is of another race other than you that are negative, disparaging, discriminatory. So it becomes much more targeted in my view. And again, I'm not looking at a textbook here or anything, but that bias is very broad and wide, and you can, there, of course, there's political bias. We see this frequently. So there's all ways that bias can go, but racism would be targeted against a person of another race.
We have here in the comments too that bias refers to the lens through which you look. Everyone has bias.
Yeah.
Thank you for adding that, Tina.
And I guess I think I'll just jump a little bit here into this. Bias, I think of it a little bit more internally. It has to do with our thinking and our framing of our thinking. And then racism is more about the actions, right? The impact on individuals and the denying of access, opportunity, those kinds of things. So bias can certainly turn into racism, but it also doesn't necessarily have to. So I think of bias as a little bit more of the internal mechanisms, and racism is what actually, the consequences to individuals.
I'll read this other comment that we have here, but bias is conscious or unconscious prejudice. Racism is when bias is put into practice. I think it's great. I don't know who wrote that. They were anonymous, but I think that's a good statement. I know I wanted to get into privilege a little bit, so ask a couple of questions about that before, we're at 8 o'clock already. So we understand if you guys need to get going, but I think we have some important questions here. So thinking back to the James Corden video, one of the messages at the end of the video was that people of privilege can help by listening to minorities and not make it about their feelings. What are the dangers of people responding to minority feedback in a way that makes it about their feelings? Lee, why don't we go with you first?
Sure. I think it goes back to who's centered in the discussion, right? Who, who gets kind of that focus. And so we as white people have to suck it up, and we have to be able to hear the difficult things. And, I remember and I wish I could credit the person, but they talked about, the biggest danger to white people is that our feelings might get hurt. We might feel badly about ourselves, but to Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, that's often life and death. So we can take on a little bit of hurt feelings and saying, it might be hard for us to hear some of these things, but that's kind of our biggest risk in these discussions, and that we really do have to open ourselves up to the hard talk, even though it can be difficult. But we really need to be sure that we're centering, and Anne was talking about that just beautifully. So I think she said it really, really well, and not to expect people to share their traumas, but find ways to listen when people offer that and be receptive to that.
That goes really well with our next question of, do you think it was hard for that person to have a conversation with them, and why or why not? And Anne, I'll throw it to you.
I don't know the person personally, but it could be yes or no. It could be yes, because it's an emotionally draining conversation to have, but no, because as someone who's non-white, it's a conversation you unfortunately have to have all the time. So I think, it can go either way, but I think that like the main thing the problem with when talking to a white person about race and having them act very emotionally is that it feels almost like gaslighting. When I was in high school, I encountered a woman who started off the conversation with the statement, "I just don't understand why I can't say the N-word, or why I can't be racist towards, or why I can't say race jokes towards people of color, but people of color can make jokes about white people. Like, isn't that racism?" And I tried to explain to her like systems of oppression and how we don't really have any right to tell Black people how to live or how to speak as non-Black people. And she just didn't understand that. She then got angry and asked me to prove how I was oppressed. She told me that there was no way I could be oppressed because I live in Wheaton and because Wheaton is a nice neighborhood. So she held on to the unfortunately common mentality that oppression and privilege only regards to socioeconomic scales and only regards to how much money or wealth you have or where you live. She just totally disregarded the whole racism thing. And it was exhausting. I remember after that conversation, I was physically shaking, not necessarily with anger, but just with frustration, because I was trying so hard to make my existence palatable to her, and speak in a way, well, anything I said, she would just be like, yeah, but like, what about me? What about me? And she got very emotional, and it creates this barrier between you and the person who's trying to inform you about something that you are not the expert on. So yeah, to any of the white people who are watching tonight, be very conscious about your emotional state, or whether or not you should be questioning people of color in the ways that you're questioning them.
I also find avoiding the conversation, when people avoid the conversation entirely, we actually have been talking about this in the equity, or I guess we talked about it a little bit in the equity task force meeting the other day too, is that since for a lot of people it doesn't touch them, they don't want to participate in the conversation, come to these library discussions or acknowledge some of the things that are happening out there in the world. And I think that can be damaging just as well, right? So not only being able to listen, but like understanding the importance of it, and not kind of just, it doesn't affect my life, so I'm not going to pay attention. So I think that's an important one. I think I'd like to kind of end our conversation here and kind of open it up to all of the panelists to respond. But what do you think people can do to make it easier for, what tips do you have to have these conversations easier? What could have what could have James done in that situation to make it easier for his colleague to speak to him about racism? Caroline, I'll start with you.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I think really what it where I will start is, and this is a hard one. This gets what gets thrown around a lot in our society is, oh, do the self-reflection, check in with yourself. But I feel like that is so crucial. And what I think, I was lingering on what you were talking about, which was, first of all, incredibly sad and hard to listen to, and also realizing, thinking about the person who would be making the choices to say that, and actively sort of tracking that person's, that, like, she was not willing to be, she or he was, they were not willing to be in that discomfort. It's like the discomfort was so hard to be with, that that person had to make excuses and try to, pigeonhole you, and it's a really perfect example, because really what that illuminates and highlights is, we are taught, if we live inside white skin, that we are deserving of certain things, and that we get to be comfortable. And if I can make a connection back to history, if we think about, I know the next session of the series will be on systemic racism, but if we go back to times where Black people were enslaved in this country for hundreds of years, and that was that they were in service of white people's comfort. So I know that this is like really, it's a harsh thing to say, and it's also what we know from history, that I'm having an image right now of a slave house which had the porches, the wraparound porches, and the wraparound porches were there so that the white owners could be on those porches watching their Black slaves toil in the fields in very, difficult conditions for sun up to sundown, extreme heat, and we go into that. There's story, but if we think about that, we have inherited a system of, we get to be comfortable. If we're white, we get to be comfortable. So, and some people have assimilated into whiteness. I came from two cultures that assimilated into whiteness. So my family background, we were not always white. So it was like fighting to, okay, we want to get to that level of, privilege and comfort. So I don't know if that's fully addressing the question. It's such a big question, but
No, that's it. Whatever you would like to contribute is totally fine. Tim, do you have any tips or ideas for how people can make it easier to have these types of conversations, or what people can do as a recipient of feedback? Oh, Caroline,
I forgot I was going to say one more thing. I apologize.
Sure.
And that is that in the idea of, how difficult it is for us to be uncomfortable as white people, the tip that I was leading up to is that white people need to talk to each other about these things. So rather than making a person of color be in the hot seat and, you're my teacher, Anne, you're my teacher, Anjali, no, we need to talk to each other. So I think as we think about Wheaton, where are there spaces where white people can talk to each other and just really bring those things to the table and try to find problem solve together and find ways to be better allies and partners. So sorry about that.
No, you're great. Tim, would you like to add any thoughts?
I don't know. It's a tough one. I don't know. I'm not sure sometimes if I'm really good at this one or not, but I think it is. It's listening. It's keeping, I do think sometimes it's just keeping your mouth shut and listening empathetically and not taking things personally, but yet still owning things. There are things that we need to own that I myself personally may have not done, but I can still own. And I hope that helps to, to take some responsibility for things that I may personally not have done myself, but others like me have. But then, yeah, I like what was said. It's having these conversations with other people in a majority culture publicly. it's got to be difficult. I can't imagine, but it's got to be difficult to know whether or not someone wants to be an ally, right? And I think the more we have these conversations in public spaces, the more people in our community can know that we're willing and open.
Great, thank you. Lee, would you like to add anything? Oh, sorry. Lee, go ahead. We'll get.
Sure. I guess as I have over the years tried to listen to Black, Indigenous, people of color, and white people will ask, what can we do? What can we do? And often that puts the work on the Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? So consistently I've heard, do the work, right? White people need to do the work. And so that builds on both what Caroline and Tim have said, is that, we created this, right? And again, it's not our fault, but as Tim said, it's our responsibility. And so we need to spend the time and have those conversations. And I don't think it's linear. The one question that talked about, well, if we've done this, then what do we do? I see it more as, circling back, and how do we build on what we do know and improving. And it's going to be maybe small, little baby steps and incremental kinds of things. And that gets back to the listening to other people. So I think I might have learned something, and then I find out I maybe don't know as much as I thought I did. That's kind of the learning process in general, right? So I think it's important to absolutely do the work, talk to other white people, because that's where we can kind of play out some of the things without perpetuating harm, right? So we have to be sure that we're halfway decent, I think, because I know there are so many people who are willing to give us grace, and that's much appreciated, but that shouldn't be expected. So I think the more we can play out all our foibles and frustrations and misunderstandings amongst ourselves, and again, within the communities who've created these structures, then the more inclined we are to create that space for everybody to come together as a community, right? If it's partially our responsibility to make sure that's a safer place, I feel like. And so the more I can realize how I harm people, and the more I can try and keep that from happening, I think by definition, that's going to create space for other people to feel like they can be themselves.
Awesome. And Anne, I know you wanted to contribute here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just really appreciated Mr. Tim's comment about just starting off saying, like, I'm not an expert. I think that is just so amazing to be able to acknowledge that maybe I don't know everything that there is to know about race. I'm a person who's constantly learning, and that's okay, is huge and really does aid so much in this conversation. It's difficult to try to teach someone something when they think that they've already learned all there is to learn. So keeping an open mind and admitting I am not an expert, and I would love to listen and I would love to grow, really just allows both people in the conversation to grow together towards a common mentality, so I really just appreciate that.
I think really the end goal here is to be open. That's really what we wanted to talk about. Unless there's any other really pressing, there's Q&A. Didn't see that yet.
It was a comment off of what Caroline was saying, like referring to the master bedroom in a house is left over from slavery when she's talking about the wraparound porches.
There's actually a lot of those things too, like in my line of work, there's like blacklisting and whitelisting and master slave in technology and automation. So it's really eye-opening when you actually think about all of those things. But any other final wrap-up comments from our panelists?
I just wanted to share, I appreciated, Tim, what you said about the willingness of white people to have conversations in public spaces. And I also want to add that it may start also with having conversations in private spaces or having conversations with one person. I know for me and maybe for a lot of people, when we think of the holidays and Thanksgiving, we think of the relatives that maybe say things differently than you would say them. the stereotypical racist cousin, and just like some of those are, I've been teaching for many years, but those are the scarier conversations. So that's part of the work, do the work, right? Having those private conversations, and then having conversations when you find like-minded people that, I need a safe space to be able to just really check out what I'm experiencing, and all of that, weaving all of that into the public conversation as well, so that it doesn't remain hidden, so that we can actually impact change in our society and our community.
Excellent. Yeah, so I think these conversations are important. I think the part 1 and part 2 has been a lot about self-reflection, being open to a conversation. So we talked about part 3, we'll be getting really into systemic racism and in our history, and talking about that a little bit more. So with all that said, I hope you guys do all sign up for our next one. I think it's on December 5th.
December 3rd. I want to say December 3rd.
Yeah.
And that'll be up on our calendar soon, hopefully. So stay tuned, and we'll send you an email to remind you as well. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight, especially with election results coming in. So, and thank you so much to our panelists. That was amazing. Thank you for being here tonight, and everyone have a safe and healthy night.